When an arrogant Italian journalist tried to corner Captain Ibrahim Traoré about his alleged ties to non-African powers, he thought his sharp questions would expose the young revolutionary leader as nothing more than a geopolitical puppet. But what Traoré said in response left the entire studio in stunned silence. But before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. 2 weeks after Ibrahim Traoré, a 35-year-old former artillery commander, had stunned the world by taking the reins of Burkina Faso through a popular uprising, global media was still in a frenzy. Political analysts debated whether his rise marked a new dawn for Africa or a dangerous step backward. News networks raced to secure exclusive interviews with the defiant captain who had dared to expel French troops and reject IMF dictates. Marco Santelli, one of Italy's most prominent and confrontational television journalists, managed to land what he believed would be the highlight of his career. Traoré's first major appearance on Western media since assuming power. Known across Europe for his aggressive tactics and piercing questions, Santelli had no intention of offering a polite discussion about Pan-African ideals or youth mobilization. In his Milan studio, Santelli rehearsed his ambush with his producers. This wouldn't be a diplomatic interview, it would be a political trap. Santelli was convinced that Traoré's anti-imperialist rhetoric was just a front, and that behind the slogans, he was being steered by hidden powers, perhaps Moscow, Beijing, or radical movements with their own agendas. And the fact that Traoré had already welcomed envoys from non-Western nations only deepened Santelli's suspicion. What the journalist didn't anticipate was that he was about to face a man whose convictions had been forged not in marble palaces or academic halls, but in the trenches of national crisis, among civilians scarred by terrorism and youth yearning for dignity. The studio lights brightened, casting a stark glow on the sleek set as Ibrahim Traoré entered in a crisp military uniform, his beret tilted with quiet defiance. At just 35, he walked with the weight of a people's hope on his shoulders. His expression was calm, his bearing unapologetically confident, like someone who had walked through real fire and returned with purpose, not pride. Santelli rose with a practiced smile and a formal greeting, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. The cameras began rolling. "Captain Traoré," Santelli began, his voice smooth like a seasoned interrogator, "you've become the face of a new Africa. But how do you respond to those who say a young soldier, barely known outside Burkina Faso, can't possibly lead a nation, let alone challenge the global order?" Traoré gave a slight smile, his hands resting peacefully in his lap. "Marco, Africa has never lacked leaders. It has lacked space to lead on its own terms," he replied in a steady voice. "You see a young man from Burkina Faso, but I speak with the voice of generations silenced by external debts, military bases, and stolen futures. My age is not the issue. My mission is." Santelli nodded, but there was a flicker in his eyes. He was only warming up. "Of course, Captain, but surely you understand the concerns in Europe about your alignment. Expelling French forces, rejecting IMF assistance. Some say you're isolating your country, that you're embracing chaos." Traoré didn't flinch. His response was calm, deliberate. "Our sovereignty is not chaos. Our dignity is not a threat. When we say no to foreign troops, we're not turning our backs on the world. We're standing up for ourselves. These aren't radical ideas. They're the bare minimum of respect any nation deserves." "They're not Western values, Marco. They're human values," Traoré said firmly. "The right to raise a family in safety, the right to speak your language, walk your land, and believe in something greater than fear. These don't belong to any political bloc. They belong to all people." Santelli leaned in slightly, sensing an opening. "But Captain Traoré, surely you recognize that your Burkinabe background brings certain biases. Your stance on family, national identity, foreign education, and even morality. Critics say these positions align too closely with global populist or anti-globalist ideologies. Isn't that a concern?" Traoré's gaze remained calm, but those who knew him would have noticed the subtle hardening of his eyes. "I believe in the dignity of family. I believe children should grow up without bombs over their heads or cartoons that confuse their identities. I believe every nation has a right to define its own values without needing permission from Paris, Washington, or Brussels." If that sounds familiar to some political movements, then perhaps they're echoing truths we've been shouting for decades, not the other way around. Santelli's tone grew sharper, more direct. Some argue that Burkina Faso, under your leadership, has become too politicized, too reactive, that you're not just defying the West, but inviting division. How do you answer those who worry you're exporting that same confrontational stance to the rest of Africa? Traoré took a deep breath, his pause deliberate. The air in the studio thickened with anticipation. I've seen what division really looks like, Marco. I've buried comrades, seen children orphaned by terror, and watched mothers starve while trucks full of gold left their villages. That's not ideology, that's reality. And no, I'm not exporting anything. I'm resisting what was imported. Santelli flipped through his notes, searching for a more pointed angle. Speaking of foreign influence, he said, you recently met with the Russian ambassador and received envoys from Mali and Guinea, nations also distancing themselves from the West. Can you tell us about those conversations? For the first time, Traoré's face softened with something close to warmth. I met with leaders who, like me, want dignity for their people. One of them told me how his grandmother taught him to carry water barefoot at dawn just to survive, and how that memory still drives him to protect his nation. Another spoke of soldiers who haven't been paid in months, but still patrol their borders because they believe in something bigger than themselves. He paused, his voice quiet but resolute. When a man speaks of his grandmother like that, or his soldiers like that, you don't hear propaganda. You hear pain, and you hear purpose. Santelli leaned forward again, his voice slower, calculated. So you were moved by these personal stories. I was moved by their hearts, Traoré replied simply. One of them asked me to pray, not in the religious sense, but to stand with them. For African children who go to bed hungry, for mothers selling their last belongings to pay for medicine, for villages forgotten by the world. He looked Santelli directly in the eye. Marco, when someone asks you to stand for your people, you don't ask about their geopolitical alignment first. Shared struggle, Santelli repeated, now clearly sensing narrative gold. So you do support their political vision for Africa? Traoré's expression grew resolute. I share their tears, Marco. Real tears for real people suffering in silence. That's not politics. That's responsibility. That's solidarity. Santelli's jaw visibly clenched. His plan to portray Traoré as ideologically compromised was unraveling under the weight of lived experience and moral clarity. But he wasn't finished, yet. I share their concern for the family, Traoré clarified patiently. The family is the root of any society. If we lose that, we lose everything. And I share the desire to shield children from the poisons that rob them of their innocence, whether those poisons come through violence, media, exploitation, or neglect. These aren't political stances, Marco. They are moral imperatives. He leaned slightly forward, his tone still calm but unmistakably firm. Any leader, left, right, African, Western, who stands up for the innocent, who works to strengthen families and protect the future of children, will always find our support in that cause. Santelli's expression sharpened, sensing he was building toward a climactic point. But Captain, he said, you must know how such statements will be perceived, meeting with anti-imperialist African leaders, expressing alignment on family structure and national values. Isn't that, in effect, political alignment? Traoré's tone remained composed, but a flicker of steel appeared beneath the surface. Marco, when Thomas Sankara spoke with farmers, was he becoming a peasant? When Mandela shared a table with his jailers, was he endorsing apartheid? He let the words settle before continuing. A leader must be willing to speak with anyone who holds influence, especially when that influence could be used to ease suffering. It's not about endorsing systems. It's about advocating for dignity, justice, and peace, wherever a door is open. But Santelli wasn't done. Critics say you're being naive, that these leaders, whether in Africa, Russia, or beyond, are simply using you to legitimize their agendas. What do you say to that? Traoré tilted his head slightly, a glint of challenge in his eyes. And what would you have me do, Marco? Ignore the cries of our people because I fear the optics? Reject an outstretched hand before I've even heard what it holds? No, I don't prejudge intentions. I listen, I engage, then I decide. The tension in the studio thickened. Santelli was now fully abandoning any pretense of neutrality. "Let's be direct, Captain," he said, voice sharp, posture aggressive. "You haven't even met President Macron since taking power, have you? But you've met Russian envoys, hosted delegations from Guinea and Mali, and there are rumors of a summit with President Putin. What are your thoughts on the Russian president?" Traoré's body remained still, composed. He paused, thinking deliberately before speaking. "I haven't met President Putin, but I've studied his speeches, watched his moves, and I've heard what many of our African elders are saying. They see a man, flawed, yes, who speaks often of sovereignty, of resisting cultural decay, of honoring national memory. These aren't just political slogans. These are signals that some in the world are waking up to what we in Africa have always known. Dignity cannot be imported." Santelli scoffed, dropping his respectful mask. "But surely you've heard the accusations. Oppression, censorship, human rights abuses. How can you admire any of that?" Traoré's face grew more intense, his voice taking on a new gravity. "Marco, you speak of abuses and division, but let me ask you something in return. When was the last time you sat with a mother whose child died mining gold for a foreign company? When did you last speak with a father who buried his son because there was no medicine in the clinic, while European corporations made millions off our land?" He leaned in slightly. "You see controversy. I see wounds. Deep, historic wounds. And when anyone says they want to help us heal, I don't dismiss them because they're unpopular in Paris or Washington." Santelli raised his voice, frustrated. "With respect, Captain Traoré, that sounds like evasion. Your people deserve clarity. Where do you stand on these global figures and their policies?" Traoré's eyes turned sharp, his tone unshakable. "Evasive, Rusai?" he repeated calmly. "Marco, I stand exactly where my people stand, with the broken, the hungry, the betrayed. I stand with the mother who walks 20 kilometers for clean water, with the teacher who hasn't been paid in 6 months but still opens her classroom. What you call controversial, I call real life. What you call political, I call protection." The studio fell into a deadly silence. Santelli realized too late that he had challenged the wrong man. "Captain Traoré, forgive me," Santelli said, his carefully maintained mask cracking at last as he leaned in, his voice now laced with hostility. "But I believe you're being dangerously naive. These so-called allies of yours, Russia, Mali, Guinea, they're known for repression, isolationism. Yet you seem more than willing to align yourself with them." Traoré's face remained calm, but his posture changed. His shoulders straightened, his hands clasped together with quiet strength. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had stared down armed militias, global powers, and death itself without blinking. "Naive, Marco." There was steel beneath his measured tone, steel forged in a fire Santelli had never known. "You call it naive when I stand with those who dare to defend the defenseless. When I meet men who weep for their people's future, you dismiss them because of their passport or ideology." Santelli's voice rose, now close to shouting. "But at what cost, Captain? Your country's credibility, its moral authority. How can you align yourself with leaders who, in the eyes of the world, represent everything Africa should be fighting against?" Traoré rose slowly from his chair, the muted green of his uniform stark against the studio's polished set. He seemed to grow taller, more formidable, no longer just a man, but the symbol of a defiant continent. "Marco," he said, his voice quiet but unshakable, "let me explain what naive really is. Naive is believing that Africa must earn its dignity through Western approval. Naive is thinking our sovereignty should be submitted to press conferences in Paris. Naive is calling the protection of children divisive and the defense of the poor radical." His voice deepened with every word. "I've stood beside children bleeding in gold mines so your companies can fill their vaults. I've listened to parents beg for medicine while foreign troops patrolled our streets, protecting everything but us. And when I find a leader, any leader who shares that same urgent pain and calls for change, I don't ask what flag he flies. I ask what truth he speaks. Santelli's face turned red. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the weight of the moment sank in. His producer gestured frantically off camera, but the journalist was now untethered, spiraling toward professional collapse. He slapped his notes down on the desk with a sharp thud, all pretense of objectivity gone. Let's stop pretending, Captain. You've already shaken hands with Russia, Mali, Guinea. China's next. Now there are rumors of a closed-door summit with Moscow. So let me ask you outright, are you their puppet now? The studio froze. Even the camera operator stopped moving. Traoré remained perfectly still for several long seconds, his eyes locked on Santelli. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, but it seemed to echo off the walls. Marco, he said softly, I've spent my adult life serving people the world forgot. I've slept under tarps during monsoons. I've buried comrades with my own hands. I've walked into villages where the only law was fear and stood between the innocent and those who profit from chaos. He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. Do you really think a lifetime of such service could be erased by a handshake in a conference room? Santelli tried to interject, but Traoré lifted a hand, not in anger, but with quiet authority. And more importantly, he continued, voice growing firmer, your question reveals something deeply troubling, not about me, but about how you view the world. You assume that any African who dares to talk to the East must be a puppet. You assume that dignity, self-rule, or even shared values must be political schemes. He paused, letting it sink in. But what if they're not? What if they're simply truths, raw, unfiltered truths that your world no longer recognizes because it stopped listening long ago? The journalist's once confident posture was beginning to collapse on live television. Santelli shifted uneasily in his chair, his face flushed with realization. His carefully laid trap had failed spectacularly. Traoré had not only sidestepped the accusations, he had dismantled them with precision and dignity. Captain Traoré, I didn't mean to suggest, Santelli stammered, desperate to regain control. But Traoré didn't let him finish. His voice remained calm, but his tone was now unmistakably resolute. What troubles me, Marco, he said, is the assumption behind your question. That dialogue means obedience. That engagement means submission. That if I speak to a leader, I must be his servant. He leaned forward slightly, his voice now carrying the quiet power of a seasoned educator, not just a military officer. When I meet with any world leader, East or West, African or foreign, I don't come as a subordinate. I come as a representative of a sovereign people. I come not to be instructed, but to speak plainly, to advocate for the voiceless, to demand justice for the forgotten. He paused. You see, Burkina Faso doesn't serve political empires, we serve truth. And when a political movement, at its best, reflects truths we've long held sacred, like the value of family, the defense of children, and the fight for dignity, then we find common ground. Santelli attempted to interrupt. But surely you understand how this appears to the international community. Traoré's voice sharpened with quiet authority. I understand how it appears to those who view the world only through a lens of power and profit, he said. But perhaps the better question, Marco, is this. Why does talk of protecting children and defending African sovereignty make you so uncomfortable? A murmur spread through the studio. What began as an interview had transformed into something else entirely. An inversion, where the interrogator was now the examined. Traoré's demeanor softened just slightly. Marco, I don't say this to shame you. I say it because the world must hear it. I'm not here to score political points or to pander to headlines. I'm here to show what real leadership looks like in a world that has forgotten how to listen. He turned to face the camera directly. His eyes were steady, his voice clear. True leadership isn't about taking sides. It's about taking responsibility. When any leader, no matter where they're from, stands up for families, for dignity, for the innocent, we must be willing to talk. Not because we're weak, but because we're strong enough to believe that dialogue is not surrender. Dialogue is the beginning of dignity. Santelli sat frozen, his plan in ruins. The ambush had failed. The cameras captured the silence that followed, raw, unscripted, humbling. He finally muttered, "Perhaps we should wrap up." Traoré offered a faint smile. "Of course," he said, gracious as ever. "But let me leave you and our viewers with one final thought." He straightened his shoulders and delivered his closing with unwavering clarity. Real unity doesn't come from avoiding uncomfortable questions. It comes from confronting them together. Not by judging before listening, but by recognizing our shared humanity and our shared duty to build a future where no child fears and no nation begs to exist. Africa will rise, not in anyone's shadow, but in its own light. As the cameras rolled, Traoré gave a subtle nod to the audience. No blessing, no flourish, just truth. And in that truth, Marco Santelli's attempt to brand him a puppet had instead revealed the difference between real leadership and mere performance. Sometimes the greatest power is not shown through defiance, but through quiet, immovable dignity.